Welcome to this video. I'm really excited to be painting Chapter Master Helbrecht from the Black Templars today. Games Workshop very kindly sent me the model to paint for free, which was really nice of them. So I'm going to give it my best shot at painting it in the classic colour scheme. I often do standard colour schemes for things, so it's going to be a good challenge. So I started with a black primer. And then to do the golden armour, I used a few thin coats of Retributor armour. Once that was dry, I've really enjoyed using purple shade on Retributor armour for all sorts of things recently. So I kind of tried it here, giving the armour an all over wash, and then going back over some parts, all with Druchii Violet from Citadel. Once this was dry, I highlighted the armour with Retributor armour again. And then I finish off using Canoptek alloy. I think that these colours work really well together. With the armour done, I just needed to base coat in the rest of the model. I used Corvus black to base coat the tabard. You're going to need a couple of coats of this because it's quite thin. And I used Khorne red to do the cloak. For the silver parts, I wanted to bring in a bit more detail and variation, so I used two different silvers, one for the more decorative parts and one for the more mechanical parts. I used Granite Steel and Leadbelcher. Granite Steel in particular works really well with the gold and the red. It really stands out because it kind of has a bluey tone to it. Other base coats used are Khorne red again for purity seals, grey Seer and Corax White for the power sword base coat and the white emblems, Screamer pink for the leather straps, candles and sword handle, and wraithbone for the purity seals and other parchments. Each of these colours is applied thin down and takes a couple or maybe even 3 coats. When all of the base coats are dry, I used washes over most of the model. There are 4 paints that I used here: Aethermatic blue contrast paint on the sword, Nuln Oil for the silver and purple parts, Agrax Earthshade for the brown parts, and Carroburg crimson for the red. I think that putting an all-over shade is kind of seen as quite a basic technique, but I always find it really useful to bring out the detail and know what I'm doing when it comes to the highlights. All of these shades are kind of applied the same. For the power sword, you just want a really even coat of the Aethermatic blue, just tinting the whole surface to prepare for some blending in a bit. I didn't wash or shade the tabard at this point. I decided to do the highlights first instead. I started with highlighting with Dark Reaper, thinning the paint and building up in a few layers, each one a bit more central to the high points of the tabard. The second highlight is Thunderhawk blue, and then a final highlight of Fenris blue. To finish the section and blend the layers, I then gave the whole thing a shade of black, which just brings all the colours together. I used white to highlight the icons on the front of the cloak and the shoulder pads. It's really important to make sure that your hand covers this and then the battery dies on the camera. I went over most of the icons using thin layers, leaving the dark colour only in the recesses. For the Purity Seals, Parchment and Bone, I started with a highlight of Wraithbone, which is the base colour, but I found that actually it was too light of a colour for this stage, so I went kind of back over it with Ushabti Bone instead. Once this was done, I still thought the Parchment looked a bit stark with the colour transitions, so I thinned down some Skeleton Hoarde and used that all over as a glaze. For the power sword, the footage of this is not come out that great, but I used Aethermatic blue in alternating sections down the blade to start to build up the colour. On the other sections I used Apothecary white, and then whilst both are still wet, you kind of want to feather the edges of the sections to create a gradient. Once this is dry, I repeated it like 2 or 3 times, and each time you want to put the blue and the white nearer the middle of each of the sections, and then do the feathering out thing to sort of blend them together. It's kind of like a cheating wet blending, if that makes sense. And then as the Apothecary White is actually kind of just grey, I edge highlighted the sword with grey Seer, which looked a lot better than using pure white. For the eye lenses, I kept it really simple and I used Tesseract Glow technical paint. There's quite a very little green on this model, so using a green neon colour stands out really well, I think. And so here's the model almost done, with just the cloak to complete. To highlight the cloak, I used Mephiston red, thinned right down, and I painted it over the whole cloak, apart from the deepest recesses. As it's so thin, you'll need several coats, and each time I tried to cover a slightly less of the cloak to build up a bit of a gradient. And then I repeated this with Evil Sun's Scarlett, and then the Helbrecht model is finished. With the main body of the Space Marine finished, I needed to move on to the base. And for the base, what I wanted to do was really make it quite different from the model itself. bring in some contrast in terms of colour and texture and tone and grim darkness, if that makes sense. So where on the main model I might have painted him using a lot of base coats, shades and highlights, for the base what I'm going to do instead is use zenithal highlighting, zenithal priming, and then loads of contrast paints and washes. So I started with a black undercoat again, and then I used a big makeup brush to dry brush on dawnstone, grey Seer and then Corax White over the whole base, leaving the deepest shadows black. This makes a kind of cheaty, quick zenithal highlight without having to use spray cans. It's a little bit rougher, but that's kind of what I'm going for with the style of this base. I then used a bunch of different contrasts and thin paints over the parts of the models, browns, sepias, blues, all sorts of things. And when these were dry, I used a sponge dipped in brown paint to add some texture and highlights to the base. With the rest of the colours base coated in using similar colours to the main model, I gave the servitors a wash of Agrax Earthshade, and I applied a few select highlights to bring back a bit of colour to the base, for example on the skin and the blue cloaks and clothes. Finally, I did some dry brushing on the sand parts of the base with a light beige colour. I think I used Tyrant Skull, which is a dry brush paint, and then I added some flowers and tufts to the base and painted the rim black to finish off the piece. So thank you so much for watching this video. I had an absolute blast painting Chapter Master Helbrecht, and I hope that you enjoyed watching how he came together. I thought there were some really interesting tips for your painting in this video, particularly around power swords and that cool purple shading for the armour. So yeah, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please do leave it a like, and I hope to see you in my next video.